Inspector Ghote Trusts the Heart by H.R.F. Keating. Read by Sam Dastle. Chapter 9. The red-scrawled capital letters on the cheap envelope stared up at Ghote like a sudden flaming sword placed on his path. He knew immediately that this was the kidnappers again. Although this envelope was not the same shape as the other, and although one set of scrawled letters might look much like another, this was beyond doubt written by the same hand that had spelt out Mr. Desaix's name on the note left when the snatch had taken place. "It is them!" he shouted to the proprietor of Trust X, who was also staring at the red lettering, apparently equally transfixed. "Quick! The news vendor! I must see him!" And in an instant he was tugging at the long, flat bolts, top and bottom of the wide teak door, and had it open, and was looking out at the bare landing of the top floor of the high block. The sliding stainless steel doors of the lift were closed and anonymous. Above them the little lights of the indicator registered G. The ground floor? Surely there had not been time for the news vendor to have got all the way down to the ground. Had they both stood so long staring at that envelope? "The newsman," Moneyboy Desaix said, coming out onto the landing. "He is forbidden to use the lift. There are stairs there for the servants." For the first time, Ghote noticed, discreetly tucked away, a narrow doorway evidently leading to the stairs, with opposite it an equally narrow door that must be the servants' entrance to the penthouse. He ran over and started to descend the stairs as fast as his legs would operate. The stairwell was as narrow as it could be, and the steep steps were in slabby, bare concrete. Getting down them at speed was by no means easy, but Ghote forced himself to go as fast almost as if he were falling, holding out first one arm, then the other, and letting his palms smack against the rough cement walls till they stang. He must catch the news vendor. Once the man had got away from the block, there was no telling where he might go. It might be next day before he was located, and by then he could have well forgotten vital details of how he had been handed that letter and asked to deliver it. It ought not to be long since he had started his descent of these giddying stairs, and he would surely have no particular reason to hurry, so it ought to be all right. Leaping and half-falling, and saving himself in the grey light of the barely lit stairwell, Ghote wished he could stop for an instant, end the smacking clatter of his feet and hands, and hear whether there were other steps going down ahead of him. But he dared not abate by a quarter-second the speed of his downward tumble. And now from below the light of day was at every instant increasing. Would he reach the foot of the stairs without seeing his man? And now it was the final turn, and out through a slit of an archway into the concrete-paved service area at the back of the high block. There was a water tap by the wall, and a group of servants from the flats were round it, washing out cloths. Not far away from them, a boy of 15 or so was moodily examining an ancient bicycle, upended onto its saddle. To the other side, a gaggle of servants' children, naked and almost naked, played on the dusty surface like a heap of scrawny-legged puppies. "The newsman! The newsman! Where did he go?" Ghote called out with all the force of his lungs. And to his delighted surprise, the unpromising boy with the broken bicycle at once looked up. "Just gone by," he said, and he pushed out an arm, the thumb roughly pointing in the direction of the corner of the towering block nearest to Ghote. "Thank you," Ghote called as he ran. He rounded the corner, and it was all over. There, not 10 yards away, was the news vendor, a lean-fleshed individual with his head bare, the short, dark hair turning grey, wearing a battered-looking shirt and a pair of shorts, and carrying under his arm a still substantial roll of newspapers. "Newsman! Newsman!" Ghote called. The fellow turned, pulling a paper from his bundle, as if he hoped to make a quick occasional sale, no doubt at the expense of some regular customer elsewhere. Ghote presented himself in front of him, still panting hard from the chase. "You delivered a letter at the flat at the top just now," he demanded. The news vendor looked at him suspiciously. "I sell papers. I am not postman," he said. "But you delivered a letter this morning," Ghote countered, trying rapidly as he could to soften his tone to one of polite interchange. "There is nothing wrong in delivering a letter." "What if I did do that?" the news vendor replied cautiously, still clearly ready to take refuge in obstinate refusal to admit anything. "It was a letter for Mr. Desai. Mr. Desai, who lives in the penthouse at the top of the block," Ghote asked. "I do not know who is who," the newsman answered. "It is my job to take them papers, one here, one there. Who they are I do not care, only what they want, and that they pay." "But at the top," Ghote persisted, seizing on what best he could to establish good relations with this valuable witness. "At the top where you deliver so many papers, you know that." "Yes, I know." "And they pay always, yes?" Ghote asked, hoping and hoping that the wealthy proprietor of Trust X did indeed pay this humble vendor of newspapers with regularity. The man shrugged his stooping, bony shoulders. "There I am getting paid," he agreed. "And as you came to the block this morning, it was to there that someone asked you to deliver a letter with the name on it in red. If someone asks, who am I to say no? And besides, they gave money. How should I not do what I am paid money to do?" Quite right, Ghote assured him. "But all I am asking is what sort of a person was this who gave you money?" "It was a person," the newsman answered. "People are people." "But you must have seen something of him. It was a man? Was he tall or short?" "Tall? Short?" the news vendor considered. "I cannot tell." "But he paid you money. He spoke with you. Was he taller than you are yourself?" Perhaps a little." "Good. Now, was he young or old?" But the news vendor lacked all Ghote's pleasure in seeing the gradual emergence of a discernible person from chaos. His lean face took on again the look of dulled obstinacy it had worn before. "I tell you I did not look," he said. "The papers I carry are heavy. It is a long way from the newspaper dormitory. Already I was tired. A man came up to me and asked if, for money, I could take a letter. I asked how much. He gave, and I took the letter. And still I have more papers to deliver." He turned away. Ghote hurried round and blocked his path. "This is a police matter," he said more roughly. "I am an inspector of CID. The description of that man is needed. Now speak up." But he could see at once that tougher measures were being even less successful. The news vendor's obstinate look became one of blind panic. To be involved with the police, this was a sudden nightmare, and could be ended only by wishing with every cell of the mind that it was not happening. "I do not know. Nothing I saw, nothing." The words were almost inaudible. "What is your name?" Ghote demanded. He got no answer at first, but by putting his face close to the fear-blotted countenance in front of him, and driving the question in as if it were a pointed rod, he did at last obtain the muttered syllables. And then, bit by bit, he got the address. "All right, go now," he said, satisfied with this small accumulation of knowledge, and able to allow his insight into the newsman's condition to produce its proper reaction. The newsman plodded off, frightened and defeated, his bundle of papers seeming twice the burden it had been when Ghote had first spotted him. But then, Ghote thought, what more could you expect to get out of a man like that? It would be all such a one could do to get through the business of his own life, earning in a month perhaps no more than 100 rupees. 100 rupees, just one of many notes that the proprietor of Trust X had counted out to make up that sum 100 times greater that he had been willing to pay to save little Pitku. But 100 a month would mean at best squeezing yourself and your family into a single room in a tottering chawl somewhere, perhaps even sharing that with another family. How could such a man have energy for the luxury of looking about him? And then, when the newsman was some 20 yards away, and as Ghote still stared at him, standing in the bright, early morning sunshine and beginning to turn over in his mind the circumstances in which the fellow might have been given the red crayoned letter, then he stopped, turned shyly round, and called out. At first, Ghote thought he had not heard what had been called, but then he realized that there had been only 5 words, and that he had registered every one of them. "He wore red check shirt." They were not much, but they did confirm a little one of the contradictory statements that Superintendent Karandika's interrogators had obtained from the witnesses to the actual snatch. There had been talk of a shirt, either red or blue, either checked or striped, but the consensus had on the whole been for a red check shirt, and here was a gram of confirmation. Clearly, too, it was the most the news vendor was going to be able to give by way of help. But feeling that some tiny thing had after all been accomplished, Ghote went round the block to the front entrance and its luxurious lift, feeling a degree more optimistic. Up in the penthouse again, Ghote found that Moneyboy Desai, after the sharp warning about fingerprints he himself had given him the day before, had done nothing at all about the new note. It lay in its envelope still on the scatter of newspapers on the floor of the hall. Stooping down and lifting it with one fingertip at each opposite corner, Ghote examined it. But the plain envelope and the rough red capitals yielded nothing. He went over to the rosewood laminate table where the telephone was and dropped the letter onto it. Then, taking his penknife from his pocket, he succeeded in teasing up the flap of the envelope without touching the rest of it. After that, it was easy enough to slide the note inside onto the table and unfold it. It consisted of a single sheet of very ordinary writing paper, identical as far as Ghote could remember with that of the first note now undergoing, for what it was worth, laboratory examination. And as it lay on the luxurious-looking surface of the table, its message, in the same brutal red-crayoned capitals, was plain to see. "You have contact, Pellis. We might been killing boy, but we still have some heart left. Go to Great Western Hotel again at 8 today morning." Pidku was alive. That thought swept warmly through Ghote's mind in advance of his swift, cold consideration of the situation presented by this renewed communication with the kidnappers. Within instants he was busy trying to work out whether matters were now essentially any different from what they had been before something somewhere in the enormous extent of Superintendent Karandika's bandobast had betrayed to the kidnappers that the police had been brought into the affair. On first consideration, he thought that things had not changed. The kidnappers still held Pidku. From the new note it appeared that they still were making their appalling claim for the huge sum of 20 lakhs for his life, and they had begun again to set up a rendezvous to collect it. So it was simply a question of Mr. Desai going to the squalid Great Western Hotel once more, and then taking to a new rendezvous the 1 lakh, or another such sum which doubtless could be got together by the efficient Mr. Shah, if Mr. Desai had not received back the notes Superintendent Karandika now held. They would have, too, to repeat their plea to the kidnappers to settle for this sum, and to think of Pidku's father. But there should not be any difficulties about that. But what about Superintendent Karandika? The immediate temptation was simply not to tell him about this new development. Then no interference of his would ruin Mr. Desai's generous gesture. And, after all, he had said that confidence between him and the proprietor of Trust X Manufacturing was at an end. Yet, to keep the news from him would plainly be a serious dereliction of duty. Was there a way out that would satisfy both the insistent claims that the missing Pidku made and the older, more rational calls that sprang from all his years as a policeman? There was, but it did not come at all in the way Ghote had expected. It came from the tall figure of the manufacturer of Trust X standing beside him. He too had been reading those crude capitals, and drawing his own conclusions from them. "Yes," he said now, "it is as I had thought from the beginning. No one would be so cruel in their heart as to kill that boy. So this is first class, first class." He rubbed his large, well-manicured hands briskly together. "What we must do immediately," he continued, "is to inform the good Superintendent Karandika. This will give him just the advantage that he needs. In no time at all, if he listens to my advice, we will have those rogues behind bars." But, said Ghote, "but the superintendent said that all confidence between you has ceased to exist." Yes, said Moneyboy Desai. "Always when a person is at fault, he attempts to attack. But in business you must never allow such an attitude to irritate." He reached across the stark note and its envelope and picked the receiver off the white telephone. "What number should I ring for the superintendent?" he asked. Ghote told him, and as the rich man's long finger worked swiftly round the dial, he put to him a hesitant question in addition. "Mr. Desai, are you still willing to provide the sum, that is the amount, the sum that you previously mentioned?" The ringing tone from the telephone sounded out clearly in the light-filled hall. 1,00,000 of rupees, said the proprietor of Trustex with total briskness. "Certainly not. There will be no need for such ridiculous steps as that. There never was. Those men will do nothing." The insistent ringing was answered. Ghote could not bear simply to stand there and hear the proprietor of Trustex come to terms with Superintendent Karandikar. He might have gained a sneaking pleasure from hearing a superior officer who had so consistently abused and distrusted him having to take high and mighty instruction on how to do his job. But when it came to it, he found he hated to hear a civilian tell anyone in the force how to go about their job, and especially was it galling when the person being told had, after all, a deserved and envied reputation among all his colleagues for efficiency and success. So he stepped away and looked round the spacious hall, its expensive Mirzapur rugs and its sun-filled windows with their as yet unrenewed yellow velvet curtains. The pile of folded newspapers was still lying on the floor, and he stooped to pick them up. As he did so, he saw that the attempted kidnapping of little Haribai, son of the manufacturer of Trustex, the tonic you owe to your loved ones, was no longer a matter to be kept quiet. The story, showing evident signs of being a last-minute scoop, was on one of the front pages. To divert his mind still more from the exchanges between Mr. Desai and Superintendent Karandikar, they had now reached the stage of swapping flowery compliments, he began to read. The story had nothing unexpected to contribute, but it was plain that most of the facts of the affair were now public property. And naturally, they were of passionate interest to the paper. The customary aloofness of its news columns was more than once breached. Adjectives spattered. Agonizing, cruel, and heart-stretching, all were pressed into service to describe the dilemma of such a public figure as the proprietor of Trustex Manufacturing. Was he to exercise his manifest generosity? Someone had even acutely remembered the previous day's large contribution to the fund for the Bihar flood victims, or was it to be not the least shade of compromise with such miscreants? But at last Manibai Desai had ended his negotiations with Superintendent Karandikar. "Yes," he said, putting down the telephone receiver and looking across at Ghote. "Most satisfactory. The superintendent and I have agreed that this new rendezvous at the Great Western Hotel must be kept. But on this occasion, the superintendent has decided, at my advice, to act on a smaller scale altogether. I understand he failed to get the necessary cooperation in his moves last night. However, this time I do not think we will be troubled with communication breakdowns." "And you are hoping to lead his men from the Great Western Hotel to whatever new rendezvous you are given?" Ghote asked, feeling a sort of careless despondency knocking from side to side in his head. Yes. The superintendent expects a further rendezvous to be set up for a time very shortly after the call. However, we have agreed that there is no need whatsoever to allow these antisocials to set the pace. I would tell them that I cannot raise the necessary sum till at least 8 pip Emma tonight, and that will give us full time to coordinate the whole operation." "I take it," said Ghote, with continuing depression, "that this is a ruse altogether, and that you have no intention of raising any sum." No, indeed not. There is only one way to treat weak men like these," the proprietor of Trustex declared, "and that is to yield them nothing, not 1 anna." At the thought of the absolute zero of his forthcoming expenditure, a sharp grin split for an instant his wide mouth. In face of it, Ghote nevertheless resolutely squared himself to say what he felt he must. "Mr. Desai," he began, "it did not seem to me from the tone of that fellow on the telephone yesterday that these are men who are weak. I grant that they have shown, as they said, that they have some heart still. But all the same it seems to me that they would still be prepared, if driven to it, to commit some desperate deed against the little boy, Pitku." "Inspector," said Manibai Desai, with a large puffing out of his broad chest, "I have been most grateful for your support over the past 24 hours, but I must tell you that I have not always approved of the advice you have seen fit to give me." "But you yourself yesterday feared for the life of—" "Therefore," Moneyboy Desai came crashing in. "Therefore, Inspector, I think that for us there has come the parting of the ways. I no longer require your services. Go home, and I shall ask Superintendent Karandika myself to see that you have a suitable period of rest." It was the complete dismissal. "Very good, Sahib," Ghote said. He turned to the wide front door. But at that very moment there came a long, insistent, and somehow cheerful peal at its bell. "Shall I open?" Ghote asked. "Open, open," Mr. Desai said. "You are not thinking those rogues will attempt to attack me here?" He gave a ringing laugh. Ghote, with memories of his own pistol-confronted arrival some 24 hours earlier, opened the wide door. It was the press. There were 6, perhaps 7 of them, hungry, yapping, even waving their notebooks. Ghote knew and did not much like most of them. He recognized in particular an evening paper reporter whom he considered woefully irresponsible in obtaining information regardless of the propriety of its being made public. He turned to the manufacturer of Trust X. "It is the gentleman from the newspapers," he said. "May I offer a word of advice?" "Gentlemen, come in, the manufacturer of Trust X said, the scent of publicity suddenly and plainly heady in his stallion-wide nostrils. "Sahib," said Ghote urgently, "you would remember that it would not be till tonight that Superintendent Karandika would be swooping on these men once more." But the proprietor of Trust X had ceased to pay him any attention. Sadly, he went over to the lift, whose gate the journalists had left open, and set off for the ground. As the silver-walled cage plunged him swiftly downwards, his spirits sank as fast. Surely Moneyboy Desai, in his present frame of mind, all the businessmen, and Superintendent Karandika, smarting from a setback, and doubly determined to exercise the utmost cold efficiency, surely together they made a combination that would fail altogether to remember that at the heart of the case there was a little boy of 5 years of age, torn away from his home, with a life that would be so easy to snap. Chapter 10. An unexpected day at home did not bring Inspector Ghote the pleasure it ought to have done. He could not rid himself of the thought of little Pidku, presumably shut up in a back room in some crazy, overcrowded part of the city, bewildered, perhaps ill-treated, suddenly taken away from all that was familiar to him. Even the very domestic comforts unexpectedly at hand served by contrast only to nag at his sense of unease. He quarrelled with his wife. When he had arrived out of the blue, she had said something about there not being anything for him to eat at midday. He knew really that she had spoken in joke, although there was not in fact any food actually cooking. But something in him, some stubborn desire to make himself miserable, had driven him to take the remark as being seriously meant. He had replied, though he knew perfectly well that it would be quite easy for Protima to prepare something quickly, that if she was unable to cook for him, he could go and get a meal at the elite eating stall nearby. And Protima, who was looking a little tired, as if she had not in fact slept well the night before, had not laughed him out of his over-dramatized bitterness, as at other times she might have done. Instead, she had taken his mention of the elite, a place they had often poured scorn on together for suspected dirtiness and adulteration of its dishes, as a personal insult to her cooking, and she had told him to go there if he wanted. And this had made him determined not to go out, though he could see that Protima was now also determined to do nothing about getting anything to eat. So, when the time came to eat, each of them got rapidly hungry, and equally rapidly more bad-tempered. It was then that Ghote, following a private train of thought, abruptly asked whether the new supply of Trust X, which he had sent for in good time, had arrived. Protima snapped out that it had not, and that Trust X manufacturing was always bad about sending the new month's supply, and that this indicated that there was no reliance to be placed on the product in any case. Ghote wanted to reply that she was saying this only because now that he had been able to reveal to her that it was the proprietor of Trust X, no less, who had been the subject of his case, she was getting at him personally, and in addition playing on his long-held irrational faith in the tablets. But he knew that to mention this would be to expose more of his thoughts than he really wanted, and so he kept silent. And this made him yet more irritable, and even more determined to find something to accuse Protima of. For most of the afternoon he was not very successful in this unpraiseworthy aim. But eventually he found something of a stick to beat Protima with. His Ved seemed to be late coming home from school. "How many times have I told you that you must see he does not linger?" he snarled. "He is 4 minutes late only," Protima answered, "and even that is if he had come as quickly as he could. Cannot the boy be allowed to talk with one friend even?" "That is just what causes the trouble," Ghote pounced in. "2 boys start to talk, then one proposes a game, and the next thing is they are far from home and some evil person sets eyes on them." "But Ved knows well he is not to talk with evil persons." "How can a boy of that age know when a person is evil? There are so many dangers, so many people who would do any wicked thing to obtain a few paisa only." He knew perfectly well that his Ved was sturdy and reliable. He knew that he always got home in the afternoon within a set quarter of an hour. But the thought of Pidku darted thin spears of pain into his mind, sometimes easing, sometimes worsening, never stopping. "I had better go out and look for the boy," he said, putting on an air of righteousness, and knowing he was doing it. "Well, go if it pleases you," Protima answered. "Ved will like to see his Pitaji for once." "He will not like so much when I meet him," Ghote retorted. "He will not like to get a beating." And he stormed out of the house. He met Ved just beyond the gate of the little scrubby garden of the box-like government quarter-house that was his home. The boy was with 2 friends, but he broke away from them at the sight of his father. No, no," Ghote said perversely, though he had been touched to the core by this sign of preference. "I have to go out. Do not leave your friends." He walked off down the road in the direction of the despised elite eating stall at the corner, with its wooden benches and crude wooden tables and its big brass cooking pot always wafting out a smell that was at the same time both appetizing and nauseating. And what would he do now, he asked himself. He would have to end the pretense and go back home in a few minutes, and then Ved would be hurt that his happy advances had been spurned. Should he take a cup of tea at the elite, and risk getting ill? He owed it to Protima not to do that when he could have all the tea he wanted in his own house just by asking for it. And then, mercifully, the thought of buying an evening newspaper occurred to him. It would make a perfect excuse for his outing. Generally he avoided buying a paper for economy reasons, but today the purchase would be justified on the grounds of his needing to know if there were any developments in the Desai case. But even now, still attached to the last traces of his sulkiness, he refused to let himself get the paper he preferred, but paid out instead for the one that employed the reporter he particularly disliked. And this was how he came to see that Manibai Desai's decision, made in the best interests of little Pidku, to trick the kidnappers with a false ransom, was being broadcast far and wide some 3 or 4 hours before it was due to happen. He saw at once what must have occurred. Manibai Desai had refused to listen to the warning he himself had given him that among the reporters at the door of the penthouse there was at least one from an evening paper, and had simply assumed that they were all from morning papers. Thus he had confidently and brazenly disclosed the ambush plan. What would happen? Ghote stood in the full sun with the paper, whose opening 2 paragraphs alone he had read, held out in front of him. Would the kidnappers perhaps fail to see this particular paper? It was possible, of course. To judge by the spelling of the 2 notes, they were not great readers. And yet that spelling and those capital letters, so crude as to be only marginally useful as handwriting evidence, were they possibly only a disguise adopted by the clever mind behind the whole affair? There was still that business of the accuracy with which the kidnappers had fixed on 20 lakhs as the ransom sum to be accounted for. It might be purely a coincidence, but on the whole it argued that there was someone involved who would be capable of making researches into the financial standing of Trust X Manufacturing. And certainly the man who had scrawled those red crayon capitals, if they were not a disguise, would be far from capable of digging out figures like that. And then there was the elaborateness of the first scheme to get hold of the ransom money, too. Whoever had devised it had, in point of fact, defeated Superintendent Karandika. And the man who could do that was no everyday gunda from the chawls somewhere. So, if there was an intelligent head of the gang keeping well out of sight, he might perhaps be a man with a full-time job who would have to leave last-minute details to the crude individual on the telephone, Then it was more than likely that he would be reading every newspaper he could get hold of to check on each new development. And if he had read this? Ghote found that the sun-reflecting white sheet between his two outstretched arms was violently trembling. He shook his head, retreated to the dense shade of a nearby neem tree, and rapidly folding the open sheets of the paper, applied himself to a detailed study of the rest of its story on the Desai case. What he came to read first sickened him, and then frightened him. Preceded by a formal denial, the reporter had regaled his readers with the suggestion that the whole kidnapping had been planned by none other than Pitku's father. It was, according to the story, all an elaborate plot to extract money from a universally known benefactor. And the worst part of the whole business was that, although Ghote had seen for himself the old tailor's reaction to that fantastic demand for a fortune of 20 lakhs in exchange for the life of his son, yet the piling up of facts and half-facts in support of the theory began in the end to sap at his belief in the absolute innocence of Pitku's father. After all, he caught himself agreeing, the tailor had been employed apparently for many years by Moneybai Desai's first wife as well as his second, so he was bound to know a good deal about the family's habits, and perhaps even about their ability to pay just 20 lakhs, he added in spite of himself. And then there was, too, the business of the two children changing clothes. Could that, as was suggested, have been part of the plot? A cunning scheme to relieve the kidnapper of the difficulties of keeping captive an awkward and demanding boy like Haribai Desai? Abruptly, Ghote felt a need to see his own son. He wanted somehow a reassurance that innocence rang true. He left the compact shade of the neem tree and almost ran through the hot sun to his house. As he entered the little garden with its few ragged marigolds drawing a wilting existence from the already dusty soil, he heard the telephone begin to shrill. "I am here," he called, and raced inside. It was the proprietor of Trust X. "Ah, it is you, Inspector Ghote, at last. Please to come. I have asked also for Superintendent Karandika, but you I want especially. Something terrible has happened." The proprietor of Trust X had refused point-blank to say what the terrible thing was, though Ghote had been able to get out of him that at least there had not been a successful attempt to snatch the plump and fierce little Haribai. When he had said that it would take him some time to get to Mount Greatest, since he had no car, he had been commanded immediately to "Take at once taxi at my expense, my personal expense." He had done as he had been asked, and he had sat in the back of the taxi, anxiously gulping a few hastily grabbed bananas. So it was not long before once again he was shooting up the whole height of that luxurious block in the silver-walled lift, and ringing again at the bell in the wide teak door of the penthouse. A servant opened to him, recognized him, and said that his master was waiting in the drawing-room. He swiftly ushered Ghote through. Superintendent Karandika, stiffly upright and grey-faced as ever, was already present, though it looked as if he had arrived only moments before. But when Ghote entered the big, airy room with its blue raw-silk-covered sofas, its wide, shaded picture window, its rich red wall-to-wall carpeting, its radiogram and discreet refrigerator, the tall proprietor of Trust X abruptly turned away from the superintendent and came towards him almost at a run. "Inspector Ghote," he said. "Inspector, thank God you have come." "What is it?" Ghote asked, his heart pounding at the look of transformed misery on Moneybai Desai's boldly marked features. "They have sent—" The manufacturer of Trust X stopped. He shut his deep-set eyes for an instant, screwing them up as if to prevent himself getting the least glimpse of something. Then he made an awkward, badly aimed gesture in the direction of a low, round, glass-topped table not far from where Superintendent Karandika was standing. "There," he said. "There." Ghote, unable to think what to expect, went over. He saw a small package, roughly torn open. Its stiff brown paper lay like a big, open, brown-tinted lotus flower on the pool that was the table's surface. At the centre of the paper was a small collection of straw, matted, dirty, and broken, looking like the nest of a small and inefficient bird. And on that there was a sheet of white writing paper with that familiar scrawl of red crayon capitals on it. But this Ghote only half saw. What seized and gripped his attention the moment he realized what he was looking at was a little, worm-like, darkish thing lying on the white writing paper. It was, slightly crooked, the little finger of a boy of about 5 years of age. "I telephoned just now to a surgeon at Grant College, who is a very great friend of mine," said the proprietor of Trustex in a voice that sounded hollow and small. "He promised me that it would not be a matter involving great pain." Ghote passed his tongue over his dry lips. "It is what it looks like?" he asked. "The little finger?" "There cannot be any doubt about that man," Superintendent Karandika said, with a sharpness that Ghote welcomed, as if it were an acid lime he had thrust into his mouth on a day of tense, thundery heat. "In any case," said Moneybai Desai, "the father is coming. There is—" He pulled out a large white silk handkerchief and wiped his long, sloping brow. "There is a scar just higher than the knuckle," he said. "He would be able to confirm." "Yes," said Ghote. He forced himself into rational thought. The note, what did it say? He stooped, and avoiding looking too closely at the worm-like finger, read, "So, again you contact police. This is to make you believe. If you won't pay now, put yellow cloth out of window at front." The proprietor of Trustex saw what he was doing. "Already I have hung one of the yellow curtains from the hall out of the window there," he said. "I suppose they would have a watcher somewhere below. He could be anywhere." "What?" exclaimed Superintendent Karandika, pouncing. "You mean to say you have done that already? You have given in to these people?" "When I have seen that," Moneybai Desai replied with dignity, gesturing with his large right hand towards, but refusing to regard, the thin, brown, crooked tube of flesh on the thick, soft writing paper. "My good man," the superintendent said, perhaps smarting under the patronage he had received earlier, "you must not think that a mere show like this means our friends intend any real mischief. They could get a good stiff term of R.I. for this, certainly. But for men of that type, rigorous imprisonment is not so very rigorous. But they know well that if they kill that lad, we shall find them, and then one Thursday morning up at Thana jail, it will be the rope for the lot of them." Ghote knew that in a way what the superintendent had said was plain good sense. There existed a strong deterrent to a cold-blooded killing, such as the kidnappers threatened, in sending that tiny, pathetic little piece of a human body there in the packet. But such cold reasoning seemed wrong to him in face of the picture lodged in his heart of a small boy, aged only 5, with little pudgy baby hands still, on one of which now there would be a tiny bloody stump. But he realized that to make any sort of appeal to the superintendent would be hopeless, and even exceeding his duty. So, instead, he endeavored to find something to say that would establish in the superintendent's mind an image of himself as a calmly efficient officer. Then perhaps he could suggest in some way that they should go through with the process that Moneybai Desai had begun when he had hung one of his golden yellow hall curtains out of a window. "This package," he said, with as much briskness as he could muster, "we must send it as fast as possible to the lab people. There is a good deal of material involved. There may well be something for microscopic examination to show." "I suggest, Inspector," Superintendent Karandika said dryly, "that the messenger who brought the packet is a damn sight more likely to provide us with some answers than any up-in-the-air scientists." "He is here? You have caught him?" Ghote said. "Yes, Mr. Desai was telling me when you arrived. It was a boy, and he had the good sense to refuse to let him go. I am going to carry out an immediate interrogation." "Of course, sir," Ghote said. "But all the same, may I send for transport to take the packing materials to the lab?" "Oh, do what you like, Inspector," said the superintendent. "But I think you would find that when I have finished with this messenger, there will be no need of laboratories, or of treating with criminal elements." And he gave the proprietor of Trustex a look of cold hostility. Chapter 11. Moneybai Desai had detained his captive in a built-in store cupboard near the kitchen of the big penthouse. On the way to this temporary prison, he explained the circumstances of the boy's arrival.
He is young only, he said. About 12 years, I should say, and just a street boy. But he had the cheek to come up in the residence lift. How he dodged past the chaprasi, I cannot say. And then, when he rang at the door, he insisted to see me myself. You did well to detain him, Superintendent Karandikar admitted. It sounds as if he may indeed be an active accomplice. However, soon we shall see. He rubbed his hands briskly together. He told me he had been given money to put the package into my hands only, Manibhai Desai said. So, as soon as I heard that, I guessed who it might come from straight away, and I put the little blighter under lock and key. Standing now in front of the blank door of the cupboard, he took the very key from his pocket. Are you ready, then? He asked. Certainly, said the superintendent. It will not take long to deal with his sort of nonsense. Manibhai Desai inserted the key. Ghote took a pace backwards and prepared himself to counter any attempt to escape. The proprietor of Trust X turned the key with a snap and flung the cupboard door wide. There was no rush to break out. Instead, Ghote and the superintendent were confronted with the startling sight of a boy of 12, clad only in a pair of torn shorts, who was bright blue in colour from head to foot. "Come out," said Manibhai Desai, evidently not at all as amazed as Ghote by this extraordinary colour. The boy stepped lightly forward, and in the better light it was plain to see that hair, face, naked ribby torso, tattered shorts, legs, and bare feet were all a shining and exuberant blue. And it seemed that Superintendent Karandikar, for all his tigerish efficiency, was as much disconcerted as Ghote, because instead of sharply launching into his promised lightning-speed interrogation, he jabbered out a series of almost incoherent questions. "That colour, that blue, why is it? What do you mean by it?" The blue boy answered with a grin. It was a grin of clear simplicity, softly lighting up his whole blue face. And suddenly, Ghote, no doubt because the colour reminded him of that used in pictures of the gods, saw the boy as a young Krishna, the embodiment of prodigal, unthinking love. But the answer he gave was as ordinary as could be. "It is the factory," he said. "We are living next to the factory where they are making powder for sprinkling on people when it is the day of Holi. Whatever colour they are making, all the people near get on them. This month was blue." "Where is this factory?" Superintendent Karandikar barked, safely back to being the unerring interrogator. Unhesitatingly, the boy gave him the name of the factory and of a street in the Buleshwar area where it was situated. And, in answer to the next question, he described where his home was and how he lived there with his 4 sisters and widowed mother. "Get on to a telephone," the superintendent snapped at Ghote. "Ring this Holy Tints place first. Check everything. Then get a car over there as fast as you can and have the mother brought in to headquarters, if she exists." He gave the blue boy a look of unrelenting suspicion, but in return received only a smile of dazzling purity. And during the half-hour following Ghote's telephone calls, he was not able once to shake the boy from the simple story he had to tell. A man had come up to him, a man wearing a red check shirt, aged between 20 and 30, of medium height, with no distinguishing marks. He had given him the packet and precise instructions about how to deliver it, but he had not taken long to say what he had to say, and he had chosen to carry out the transaction in the deep shadow of the narrow lane next to the colour powder factory. So it had not been possible to see much of his face. He had spoken Marathi, the boy's own tongue, and finally he had given him 1 50-paisa piece, and had said that when he got back there would be another for him. "Where are you to meet him?" Superintendent Karandikar pounced, all claws. "Nowhere, Sahab," the boy said, giving his sun-shining smile again. "He said he would find me." Grunted the superintendent. A look of quick guile flashed into his eyes. "The coin," he snapped. "Where is it? Produce it." The boy dipped 2 thin blue fingers inside the cotton strap at the top of his blued-over shorts, and a moment later drew out a glinting silvery 50-paisa piece. He looked at it with glowing eyes. Wealth. The telephone rang, and Ghote, at a quick word from the superintendent, went to answer. It was from headquarters.
They had picked up the boy's mother. She confirmed his existence and said that as far as she was concerned, he was playing with his friends somewhere. "Tell me something," Ghote said to the CID sergeant he was talking to. "This woman, is there anything strange about her?"
Strange? No, unless that she is a shade of blue from head to foot. But that is from a colour powder factory there. The whole place is blue."
So they let the blue boy go. He went plunging unconcernedly down into the dark shaft of the servants' stairway, a rubber-bouncing, joy-scattering element to the last. And as the three of them stood on the landing after he had disappeared, waiting for the lift to come up and take Superintendent Karandikar down, something perhaps of the urchin's unclouded touchstone happiness must have penetrated deep even into the sparely upright tiger figure of the superintendent himself. Because, without any preamble, he abruptly favoured the proprietor of Trust X with an observation.
"It is the other fathers," he said. "It is them I have to keep in mind the whole time."
He seemed to think the remark, enigmatic though it was, needed no amplification. But to Ghote's relief, Moneyboy Desai quite quickly broke the grimly imposed silence that followed it.
"Other fathers, Superintendent," he said. "I am afraid I am not following."
The superintendent shot him an iron-grey, unyielding glance.
"Fathers whose children may be kidnapped in the future," he explained brusquely. "May be kidnapped, or rather, I say, will be kidnapped, Mr. Desai. If anybody in Bombay City is allowed to get it into his head that here is something they can get away with." "So the tailor must, if necessary, suffer?"
Moneyboy Desai asked, after a pause. But the superintendent gave him no answer. They waited, a silent trio, for perhaps a minute longer, until at last the steel doors in front of them parted with oiled smoothness, and the silver-walled waiting lift was revealed. Moneyboy Desai made no comment either as he and Ghote re-entered the penthouse and established themselves in the big, airy drawing-room under the golden gazes of its two sunburst clocks. But barely had they done so when a servant came in.
"It is the tailor, Sahib," he said to the proprietor of Trust X. "He is saying that it is you he must see, and not this time the Mem Sahib."
Mr. Desai jumped up with sharp decision from the plump and deep silk-covered sofa where he had just flung himself.
"Yes," he said, "it is I he must see. Bring him now."
Ghote found himself filled with a sense of almost unbelieving wonder. Was this the man who only a few hours before had refused ever again to offer even a single rupee to ransom Pitku? Was this the man who earlier had been so unwilling to allow his heart to respond to the call made on it that he had passed on to someone else the task of telling the father a huge sum had been demanded for his son? Was this the man? The man who was now insisting on himself breaking the news to the tailor that his only son had been, in all probability, brutally mutilated? Ghote glanced over towards the glass-topped table where that terrible straw-packed little parcel still rested, opened up like the nest of some ugly, disruptive bird. So unlikely were the words he had heard that he almost expected to see on the glass surface only a big jade ashtray or some other luxurious knick-knack. But no, there, stark with all its blood-cruel message, the packet lay. And Moneyboy Desai was proposing to tell the victim's father what it contained, and to ask him to verify that the atrocious act was exactly what it seemed.
"Sahib?"
It was the tailor. He was standing as he had done the day before, only just inside the door, and he was looking, too, quite unchanged by disaster, even to the enormous and minutely neat darn at the very centre of his singlet. And again he was asking, in a voice of the most gentle respect, what it was that he had been summoned for.
"It is you,"
the manufacturer of Trust X said, looking him slowly up and down. There were tears in his rich voice.
"Ji, Sahib, there is a terrible thing I have to tell you."
Moneyboy Desai's bold features seemed actually to be less well layered with flesh than they had been when he had dismissed Ghote not many hours earlier. Would he be able to carry out his self-imposed vow, Ghote wondered? Or would it once more fall to his own lot to tell the father what had happened to his son? But the proprietor of Trustex was clearing his throat to speak again.
"It is your son. It is Pitku. He is well. He is alive. But they have—"
Again a terrible check, and again the proprietor of Trustex forced himself to go on.
"What I must tell you is that those men they have cut off a finger."
And then, now that it was out, the almost incoherent babble of assuagement.
"It may not be him. There may be another child, a dead child perhaps, I do not know. But if it was, then already I have asked a doctor, consulted most eminent, met at charity function. It would not have hurt much. It would not have hurt him much."
Moneybai Desai's right arm shot out in a stiffened gesture, as if he were a stern schoolmaster pointing to a pool of ink on the floor. But the rigid forefinger was directed, like a held-out stick, at the untidy little nest on the round, glass-topped table. And slowly, without a word, almost circuitously, the tailor made his way across the red wall-to-wall carpeting towards it. His progress on lined and cracked bare feet was quite silent, but it nevertheless made as much effect in the big, airy room as if a shouting, demonstrating Morka was parading and protesting down its length. And then the tailor was there, at the table. He bent forward from the waist. His hand came up as if he was going to stretch out and pick up that little brown, crooked worm of flesh lying in the centre of the ragged nest. And then his arm dropped dully to his side. He leant an inch further forward. For a long ticking out of time he peered, and then slowly he straightened his back and turned towards the manufacturer of Trustex and Inspector Ghote. Ghote saw that from underneath the tape-mended lens of his spectacles a single tear was trickling down the side of that parched, aged-before-its-time face, as, wordlessly still, the old man left them. Moneybai Desai's question had been answered. The little scar above the knuckle of that small tube of flesh had delivered its message. It was, beyond doubt, Pitku's finger that had been sent to them. And, Ghote thought, it was now beyond doubt, too, how could he have ever given room to the slightest of doubts, that there was no truth at all in that vile suggestion in the paper that the tailor himself was the mastermind behind the whole affair. And then the telephone rang. For a long moment neither Ghote nor Mr. Desai was able to react properly to the sound. It was as if it was an intrusion of whose nature they could know nothing. Ghote was first to recover, but he lifted the receiver, still feeling himself to be in a remote world.
"Yes,"
he said hollowly. A voice spoke at the far end, a flat, familiar voice. Ghote clapped his hand across the telephone mouthpiece. "It is them," he jerked out, all alertness now. "It is them, the kidnappers." Moneybai Desai came over with clumsily hurried strides and took the receiver. He had barely had time to give his name when the flat voice cut in. Ghote could not hear the exact words, but the tone was plain. Curt orders were being given. But listen," Mr. Desai said after a little. The voice ignored him. It spoke a few words more.
"Yes," said Mr. Desai. "I have got a suitcase. I used it when—"
A sharp interruption.
Yes, I will. It is in leather. It is quite old. It comes from the office. They have it for carrying amounts of cash. It is what is called a Gladstone. It opens in the middle instead of having a lid."
Another terse question.
"It is brown, yes, brown leather—"
A burst of instructions, and then that click of finality that meant that once again contact with the men who had cut off little Pitku's finger had been lost.
"What did he say?" Ghote burst out. "It is to be near the gateway of India," Moneybai Desai answered, his deep-set eyes already looking into the future he was speaking of. "It is to be at Apollo Bandar tonight at 7 p.m. I am to wait under the statue of Shivaji with the money in that bag you heard me describe, and at some time it would be taken from me."
His right hand abruptly opened in a wide gesture, as if it was already letting fall the intolerable burden it had had to carry. Ghote forced the policeman in him to the surface. What new elements had been put into the situation by this move from the other side? He had rapidly to concede that their idea was a clever one. He could see what the scene would be like round about the big triumphal arch of British days. There were often hundreds of people there, and just after darkness had fallen, it would be even easier for some inconspicuous idler to pass in front of the figure of the proprietor of Trust X, standing alone underneath the big statue of the horsed Shivaji, and to snatch that bag crammed with money. Then they could pass it rapidly to a confederate, and perhaps on to yet another, then on again to a waiting car or taxi, or even drop it into a motorboat puttering past the high quay. It could be spirited away within a couple of minutes. And who among the crowd of strollers of all sorts, among the sellers of postcards and of pens, among the furtive tourist-seeking money-changers and the clamorous fortune-tellers, among the vendors of roast peanuts, of coconuts, of crushed sugar-cane, of chickpeas, who might not be one of the kidnap gang in disguise? They did not really know at all how many of them there might be in total to operate such a scheme. So far they had descriptions, vague and part contradictory, of 2 men only, the one who had soft-talked the 2 children, who had been wearing probably a red check shirt, and the driver of the getaway car, bearded certainly, but possibly a Sikh, or possibly a Muslim, and, according to the Turk-like little Haribai, without any hands. Either of these might be the one who had spoken on the telephone, the possessor of that flat voice. But surely there was also at least one other person involved, the mind at the back of the whole enterprise, the mind that had chosen this crowded and difficult place for the second attempt to pick up the ransom money, the man who had defeated Superintendent Karandika's great bandobast. And such a man might easily have at his command 20 others to take part in some complicated manoeuvre among the evening crowds in the chancy darkness of Apollo Banda, half lit by the naphtha flares of the vendors' stalls. "How much?" Ghote came back with a jerk from his reverie. The proprietor of Trust X was putting a question to him, and as he returned to reality, he realized with a feeling of suddenly acute panic just what that question was, and how utterly impossible it was for him finally to answer it. How much? How much should now be offered to the kidnappers to release little Pitku? Well, sums could be discussed, perhaps, if the matter was treated carefully. But the question itself ought not really to have even been raised, because overriding it came the question of whether any money should be offered at all. Or, more precisely, whether Superintendent Karandika, cold protector of those other fathers, ought not to be informed about this new development as soon as he had got back to headquarters. If he was, it would mean, Ghote had no doubt, a firm, explicit, and immediate order that the brown Gladstone bag should once again contain only dummy notes. But he himself felt by no means convinced yet that this was the right course. Something in him revolted at it still. "Sahib," he said cautiously to Moneybai Desai, "the matter of money is something that you are bound to discuss with the police, since we have been introduced into the affair." "But I am discussing," Moneybai Desai said. "I am discussing with you." Ghote would have liked to have accepted this. He forced himself to speak again. "With Superintendent Karandikar." The words came out in a hoarse choke. Immediately the proprietor of Trust X flushed up. "With that man I am not discussing," he said, his voice rising. "Already he has been responsible for such cruelty to that boy." "But he is my superior officer," Ghote answered, bleakly forcing himself on against the beating of his will. "You must forget all that," Moneybai Desai said, his bold features shining with fervour. "The time for orders and chain of command is gone. Those evil men would stop at nothing. It might have been my little Hari that they had taken." The vision of that little Turk in the hands of the kidnappers in place of the beaten-down tailor's Pitku for a moment distracted Ghote. He felt then that he might have had another view entirely of the situation if the domineering Haribai had been the victim. But at once he knew that this was not so, that however unlikable a child Haribai was, there were things he ought never in any circumstances to be subjected to. Yet still he could not allow himself fully to agree with Haribai's father. "No, Sahib, I am sorry," he said obstinately. "I am a police officer,
and it is my duty to report developments in a case to my superior." "Listen," Mr. Desai replied, flinging his arms wide. "Listen, I am needing you. You can resign from the police." "No, I am a policeman." "Then go on being a policeman. Be a policeman for Trust X Manufacturing. We are getting to be a concern on such a large scale that I can no longer oversee all myself. There are departments already I have not visited for months, even when they are doing new things. There is regional ordering, there is goods outward. I am needing a trusted assistant to check such places. Come, come." A broad and rosy avenue opened before Ghote. He longed to take it. All his dilemmas of this moment would be ended. He would, in all probability, better his financial position. He should be able, in such a job as Mr. Desai was holding out, to act as he felt he ought, as he could not do now. And then black fogs of doubt planted themselves in his way. To act as his better feelings dictated, when he would have to carry out the behests of the owner of Trust X Manufacturing? No, there would be occasions in plenty when clashes arose there. To give up the way of life that was implanted in his heart as surely as the feelings he now had for poor, protectionless Pidku? "No, Sahib, no, it is not possible." "Then you can get out. Go, go, go." Ghote stood squarely. "Yes, I will go if you no longer require the assistance I was assigned to give," he said. "But go or stay, I must do my duty and inform Superintendent Karandika, as per earliest convenience, of developments to date."
Chapter 12. Ghote stayed. The proprietor of Trust X gave in, with very bad grace, and Ghote made his call to Superintendent Karandika, informing him in full of the latest telephone call from the kidnappers and its new rendezvous at the gateway of India. And during the period of something less than 2 hours before the new drop was due to take place, he was busy enough. He supervised the dispatch to the CID laboratory of the bird's nest parcel and its terrible, tiny contents, and telephoned at length to explain the urgency of dealing with it as quickly as possible, cunningly invoking the name of Superintendent Karandika. "You are to report to him personally," to ensure priority treatment. He also assisted the proprietor of Trust X in checking over a new lakh of rupees brought in person by my accounts department, or the much-tried Mr. Shah. This new sum they added to the original lakh which Superintendent Karandika had released, not without reluctance, now that he had been informed of the kidnappers' latest move. And they wrote, too, another note in almost the same terms as the one Superintendent Karandika had found in the white box, begging the kidnappers to accept this lesser sum. Altogether, it was an uneasy time. Mr. Desai never lost the resentment that the turning down of his offer of a post with Trust X Manufacturing had aroused in him. When Superintendent Karandika rang to explain the arrangements for ambushing the new drop point, he stood beside Ghote at the telephone and hissed awkward directions at him every few seconds. "Tell that I have put paper in the bag only, not the 2 lakhs. Say something so that he would think the lakh he sent back has gone to office safe. Say I will not have any of his men at all near me beside the Shivaji statue." Obediently, Ghote relayed these requests, suitably modified, and obediently he relayed back the counter-requests of Superintendent Karandika. "You will inform Mr. Desai he is not on any account to move from his place under the statue. Tell Mr. Desai he is to hold hard onto the case when the attempt is made to grab it, and at the same time he is to signal with his free arm." At this, of course, Moneybai Desai had retorted for Ghote's own information that he was going to do everything in his power to shelter whoever would seize the bag. Ghote thought it most prudent to bring the call to an end as rapidly as he could. Nor was the situation in the penthouse made any easier by the arrival, from a Lions Club bridge drive in aid of the Help the Handicap campaign, of Mrs. Desai. "Not a word about all this," Moneybai Desai muttered to Ghote, as her ringing voice was heard from the hall, berating a servant for not coming more quickly. But the very first thing Mrs. Desai wanted to know when she came into the drawing-room was whether "this nonsense about the tailor's boy is over and done with yet." Her husband, by way of reply, indicated Inspector Ghote. Ghote contrived to say something about "steady progress is, however, being made." And then he had to listen to a lecture, which he felt to be somewhat justified, on how lower-grade public officials always avoid giving direct answers to questions. He might have accepted it without too much inward concern had it not ended with a pointed reference to the Commissioner and his wife. Mrs. Desai even moved towards the refrigerator cabinet as if to take the telephone and ring her patron there and then. But her husband strode across and placed his tall frame between her and the instrument. "Please," he said, "there may be important call just coming." "It is from those men? They are asking for more money?" No. It is a business matter only." "Business? At this time? It is 6:15 already." Yes, it is late. But I have had to tell Shah to stay on in his seat. He is behindhand with his figures once more. The state of affairs in accounts is disgraceful. He has asked even to have assistant." It seemed, however, that denunciations of Mr. Shah were an excuse that rang true, because Mrs. Desai declared, with a shrug of her lithe and elegant shoulders, "In any case, I have no time to be talking this and talking that. I have to find something to wear tonight." And off she went. So Superintendent Karandika's final call, detailing the last of his arrangements, was received without interruption. "A small force, but a good one," he barked down the line to Ghote. "Every man briefed by myself in person. Every man knowing to the last footstep what his task is. Security 100%. I myself in on-the-spot charge of all operations for the whole of Apollo Bandar. And you, Inspector, from your position in the chauffeur's place of Mr. Desai's vehicle, in constant visual contact with me. I shall be wearing the disguise of a Muslim woman in a burqa." But Superintendent Sahib, how shall I tell you it is you when you are covered from head to foot in black?" "Do not interrupt, Inspector, when I am giving you your orders." "No, sir." "I shall be dressed in a burqa, but I shall also be carrying a bundle wrapped in orange cloth. Orange is the best colour for long-distance observation, Inspector." "Yes, sir." "The bundle will contain my personal walkie-talkie, keeping me in full touch with every aspect of the case wherever it occurs." "Excellent, Superintendent. A first-class stroke, sir." "In the event of unexpected moves, I shall be able to order immediate counteraction. I do not think that case of false banknotes will get very far, Inspector, even if it leaves his hands." "No, sir. I shall see you at the gateway then, sir." Ghote looked across at the top of the big radiogram, on which there rested the Gladstone bag, safely containing packet after packet of real 50 and 100-rupee notes. Mr. Desai followed his gaze. "We must go," he said, looking up at one of his sunburst clocks. "It is 6:20 already." "I think we ought not to leave too early," Ghote replied, wondering nevertheless whether he really needed to oppose the proprietor of Trustex once again. "It is possible that the superintendent will have some last-second orders still." "But what if there are traffic delays?" Mr. Desai said, moving over anxiously towards the money bag. "Half an hour is more than time enough to reach the gateway only," Ghote answered, finding himself determined, against his own beating inner inclination, to act in the calm manner Superintendent Karandika would expect. "I think we should go now," the manufacturer of Trustex said, with an excess of his formidable coldness. "I am sorry, Sahib, I must await my possible final orders, but I will go and make sure I have your chauffeur's cap and coat." The white high-buttoned coat and the white cap with the glossy black peak had been ready in the hall for the past hour, waiting to be snatched up. But Ghote knew that to stay in the same room as Moneyboy Desai now was to risk another explosion. Outside in the hall he stood and waited. It was not very likely, really, that Superintendent Karandika would ring up again with some last addition to his orders, though it was possible. But what he really hoped, he recognized now, was that somehow the superintendent would undergo a change of mind, and that he would ring to say that if the proprietor of Trustex really wanted to let the kidnappers have some sum of money, then he could do so. Yet, if the superintendent did do this, as he never would, he would as likely as not be wrong, Ghote acknowledged sadly to himself. When all was said and done, the rational thing was to refuse to give in to grasping and evil men. Even if the kidnappers were going to be given as much as the whole 20 lakhs that would put Trustex manufacturing on the verge of financial collapse, they would quite possibly simply demand yet more. With men without principle, as men who would steal a child must be, there could never be any safe dealing. And yet... But then the telephone did ring. Ghote, quite forgetting that one of Mr. Desaix's cherished swarm of instruments was in the hall, rushed back to the drawing-room. The manufacturer of Trustex had already picked up the receiver. "Yes, yes," he was shouting. "What is it?" Ghote stepped up beside him to take the call, unable not to hint in his attitude at a slightly contemptuous coolness, though he was far from feeling cool. Would Superintendent Karandikar possibly, after all, allow the soft alternative? And then he heard the voice coming from the receiver. It was not Superintendent Karandikar's. It was the flat tones of the spokesman of the kidnappers. "Change of place to meet. Go instead in car to GPO. Have the money beside you in back. Tell chauffeur to drive all the way to KEM Hospital. Go by Crawford Market, Bendi Bazaar, Nair Hospital, and Victoria Gardens. Somewhere you would be stop. Leave at once. Now." The far-end receiver was jammed sharply down. Nerves were once again stretched in the enemy camp. Moneyboy Desai looked at Ghote. Ghote looked back at him. "He said to depart straight away," Mr. Desai proposed, sudden elation shining in his deep-set eyes. Ghote gave one brief spurt of thought to Superintendent Karandikar, and all the men he would have, already mingling alertly, yet perhaps conspicuously, among the evening crowd round the Gateway of India. Quite soon now the superintendent, his spare and upright form draped from head to foot in the unlikely thick black flowing folds of a burqa, would be taking his place among them. Perhaps he had already left to do so, and would be at this moment out of contact. Yet, on the other hand, the black burqa-clad figure was to carry a large orange bundle, and that bundle was to conceal a two-way radio. So the superintendent could be informed of this sudden switch in the kidnapper's plan, a deliberate device, no doubt, to avoid just the sort of ambush he had set up. He could be informed, but only at the cost of some delay, and the kidnappers had said, "Leave at once." So, to do what Mr. Desai, with a gleam of freedom in his eyes, had just proposed, and to leave this very moment, would not be altogether acting in an unreasonable way. The notion hovered. And then into his mind there came again the vision of that long, jagged-edged butcher's knife, and the milky soft flesh of a 5-year-old's throat beneath it. He ran across to the long, low-slung radiogram, gave Moneyboy Desai a swift grin of complicity, and snatched up the money-filled Gladstone bag. Darkness came just as Ghote brought Moneyboy Desai's big Buick up to the massive pile of the General Post Office building, approaching it from the south after a wide and hurried sweep down from Kambala Hill, and round through the fort area of the city, so as to start the itinerary the kidnappers had set from its very beginning. It was possible, he reasoned, that they intended to make their bid for the Gladstone bag here at the very start, where there was plenty of traffic, and the chances of a jam holding up the Buick were about 100 to 1 in favour. Indeed, as he took the big car round to the left so as to pass the ornate, palm-dotted facade of VT Station, there were 3 separate occasions when he was forced to a halt. At each one he delayed as long as he could, once in fact till the irate man at the wheel of an ambassador behind him blared hard on the forbidden horn, but no one slipped out of the jostling crowds on the pavements, as he had half expected, jerked open the car's rear door, and grabbed the stout brown leather bag. Up along to Crawford Market, past the tall office buildings darkened now, and past all the hectoring billboards with their clamorous messages in English, Marathi, and Gujarati, there was no opportunity to stop. But in the gloom of one of the long arcades here, would one of the kidnappers perhaps be waiting to check that the Buick had gone by in accordance with their orders? Perhaps they would. At the gap in the opened glass panel behind his head, Moneyboy Desai's face loomed forwards. "What if they had wanted to make their attempt just now?" he asked. Ghote shrugged his shoulders in their white uniform coat. "I do not think they will risk the car having to stop by chance," he answered. "What we have to look for is something done deliberately to cause a stoppage.
Yes, but what could that be? Mr. Desai asked, anxious as a child about to get a mysterious treat. It would be easy enough to arrange, Ghote said. They could half-block the road somewhere ahead where it is narrower, with someone carrying out unauthorized automotive repairs. Or even easier, they could arrange a false breakdown. Every day my colleagues in the traffic department are complaining. One breakdown, and there is a jam that can last half an hour or more. And you know how often cars go wrong. Behind him he detected Manibhai Desai wagging his head in serious agreement. That is why I am always buying foreign, he explained. It is difficult sometimes over spare parts, and expensive, but— Ghote hardened his face into a proper chauffeur's impassivity at this, and concentrated on the traffic snarl ahead, where the flow of vehicles both ways along Karnak Road crossed their path. Would it be here that the kidnappers could rely on a car that was making its way northwards, having to stop? But no. Irritatingly, the lights ahead turned green, and they got across, and into Abdul Rahman Street, without actually having to come to a halt. Well, Ghote reasoned, with the thicker masses of people spilling onto the roadway from here on, in the way they always do in the living quarters of the city, there would be plenty of opportunities for a forced stop. A vendor's barrow pushed out into the road and deliberately overturned. Some sort of false procession got up at a cost of a handful of rupees. Anything. He sent the big Buick pushing slowly forward past the crowds emerging from the open-fronted shops and spilling out onto the roadway. Cyclists swerved and swayed in front of them. Handcarts piled high with sacks or bales of cloth impeded the already jerky traffic crawl. It would be easy enough for someone to break into a run and jump up onto the car here. But no one did. Bendi Bazaar, and the intersection with the wide cross-city thoroughfare of Sardar Patel Road. People were even thicker here, milling this way and that, some hurrying, others dawdling, pairs of men hand in hand slowly loitering. The stream of cars, lorries, buses crossing their path was more thrusting than anything they had yet encountered. Is this where I would do it? Ghote asked himself. It was about 1/3 of the way along the route the kidnappers had laid down. They would have had time enough, if they had wanted to check that their rules were being obeyed, to see that there were no obvious signs of a police escort, and then perhaps to telephone to a point ahead and give the all-clear. But on the other hand, in the stretch yet to come, conditions would be perhaps even more favourable for stopping a car. And it seemed that this must be the kidnappers' reasoning. Although the Buick was held up for almost 5 minutes waiting to get across into what Ghote still thought of as Parel Road, though it had been officially renamed Victoria Garden Road, there was no attempt to make contact. They made slow progress forward. Ghote felt obliged to drive with the window beside him fully down, so that if anyone wanted to give him an order to pull in, or even to turn off, there would be no difficulties placed in their way. So he caught the full force now of the dust and the odours impregnating the air all around. Drains stench, sweat smell, dung-fire reek. In his ears there racketed the noise of 1,000 jabbering, shouting voices, the grinding roar of low-gear car engines, the bang and batter of carts and handcarts, and of horses and bullocks' hooves. But he forced himself to keep alert, glanced continually from side to side, waited for the sign to come, whatever it would be. They had entered the Muslim quarter, and left it behind them, and now they had reached an area of taller, more fearsomely leaning houses. It seemed there were even more people to the square yard than before, and more noise, and sharper smells of dung, filth, garlic, spices. They were going at a snail's pace, actually pushing aside with the big car's front fender, people in the roadway, and the occasional mooning, rubbish-chewing cow. It was the perfect place. There would be no trouble at all here in opening the rear door beside Manibhai Desai and telling him to push out the Gladstone bag. There would be no difficulty in melting into the mass of humanity all around once it had been taken. Pursuit by anybody would be almost out of the question. And nothing happened. The tall shape of the Parsi statue, and the point where they had to snake right into the part of the old Parel Road, now called Dr. Ambedkar Road. Once again, a tangle of traffic brought them to a complete halt.
and once again there was no attempt at taking delivery. Had the kidnappers bungled it? Had they meant to make contact earlier and by some sheer chance been foiled? Were they even now trying to pursue the slow-moving Buick? Ghote peered and peered into the rear mirror, but all he could see was a confusion of bodies and faces, of vehicles and barrows in the jangle-lit darkness. Victoria Gardens passed by on their right, Baikala Station and the bulk of the railway hospital on their left. They came to an area where the houses were bigger, but old, battered and past all their glory. From their entrances, people by the hundred seemed to be pouring. The soft masses of old banyan and peepal trees blotted out the lights. Suddenly, Ghote became convinced of the way it would be done. There was bound to be a tree sooner or later that jutted out over the roadway. Say someone was lurking in its branches, ready to drop down on the car's roof. He awaited the heavy thud above him. But it seemed that it was not going to come. He twisted round for a moment and spoke to Manibhai Desai. "Sahib, perhaps it would be better if you were to lift up the case and put it on your knees, so that it can be seen by anybody." Yes, I will do that." The manufacturer of Trustex was as pathetically willing to please as any one of his most debt-ridden minor suppliers. Slowly the big Buick forged its way onwards. The fork to the right at Chinchpokli Road passed by. More than 2/3 of the journey had gone now. What if they had made some mistake, failed to see a signal? Would the kidnappers take that for a brutal gesture of refusal? And would they make their own infinitely more brutal reply? Again Ghote saw the jagged edge of that imagined butcher's knife and the pipe-thin neck it menaced. Ought he to have persuaded Mr. Desai to make his offer bigger? Would he have come up with 3 lakhs if a really forceful case had been presented to him? Or 2.5 lakhs? Surely that little more the manufacturer of Trustex would have granted easily enough, and it might make all the difference. If it got to them. 1/2 lakh. That little more, though a whole year's earnings, even for someone doing well in the commercial world, and in the other tray of the scales, a life. Into the area illuminated by the big car's sidelights, an old woman, bent almost double, with a sari faded to colourlessness, wrapped round her gnarled and fleshless limbs, almost failed to move herself out of the way. A life? What was one life in the middle of all the dying round them now? Yet Pidku had to be saved, that he knew in the region where the analyses and comparisons of the brain were at total discount. And now, the very last stage of their journey, Ghote took the big Buick across the traffic stream for the fork right into Government House Gate Road. Some 1/2 mile more, and they would be there. When were the kidnappers going to claim those 2 lakhs that waited for them? And it could never have been more than 2 lakhs. There had not been time to have added even 1,000 rupees more, since he and Manibhai Desai had become allies on little Pitku's behalf once again. A straight stretch of road now, with the going better than at any stage before. Perhaps, though, the appointed place would be the very end of their journey. Yet he dropped down into first and kept the big car at a silly, steady, chugging crawl. Ahead, a little to the left, the huge shape of their destination could be seen now. Was someone waiting in hiding under the shadow of the big hospital's outer wall? Was there a motor scooter, say, with its engine already running, ready to weave in and out of the traffic and the crowds in a fast getaway? Would next the Gladstone bag on its rear carrier be snatched off at the end of its run with shaking, joyful, hardly daring to believe hands? Would it be jerked open, the money counted, Manibhai Desai's new note read, a council of war held, and at last the decision be made to accept that already vast sum and let Pidku go? At the gap in the dividing panel, the proprietor of Trustex spoke. "Can you go slower?" "Sahib, already I am down to 5 miles an hour only." Yes, I saw. With the echoes of that sad voice in his head, Ghote completed at this creeping pace their long journey. He pulled the big car up against the curb beside the towering bulk of the window-glowing King Edward Memorial Hospital. In silence, they waited. Inspector Ghote Trusts the Heart by H.R.F. Keating was read by Sam Dastel.